But I love the unknown saints because I just feel like there's so much more to holiness than these little images that we have from the saints who we've stripped everything out of their lives.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Crab and the Cross podcast. I'm your host, Mary Rose, and today I'm chatting with Meg Hunter-Kilmer. Meg has an encyclopedic knowledge when it comes to the saints, and not just the saints you've heard of. I think in America, we tend to be more familiar with a lot of the European saints, saints from Italy like St. Francis, St. Anthony, saints from Spain like Teresa of Avila or St. Dominic. So many French saints, St. Therese, St. John Vianney. But how many saints can you name from India or from South Korea or from Guatemala or Honduras? Meg puts a lot of effort into representation when it comes to saints. And it's not just some kind of like Catholic affirmative action program. Like these are saints as real and as holy as the saints we all know and love in our own general Roman calendar. I think sometimes it's easy to forget the universality of the Catholic faith. Since it is the Roman Catholic Church, we tend to focus in on Rome, focus in on Europe. But as she mentions, Catholicism was in India in the 50s. St. Francis Xavier brought Christianity to Japan 100 years before St. Isaac Jogues came to America. It really is a global church. As much as Western culture, Western civilization is inherently Judeo-Christian, Christianity is not inherently Western. It is global. And I love the universality that Meg's work speaks to. It reminds me of that passage in the book of Revelation when it talks about heaven, how there's people from every tongue, every race, every nation. A global church is a beautiful church. And that's not just some sort of like politically correct, nice thing to say. It really is true. So yeah, definitely check out Meg's books and also just give her a follow on Instagram. She tells a lot of these stories on there and it's completely free. It's a great way to learn. Great way to get to know your future neighbors in heaven, right? That's what the saints are. And also just a friendly request to please give me a rating and a written review in Apple Podcasts. I can just see somebody coming across the podcast and they're like, okay, the crab and the cross, what is this all about? And then they look at the cover art and they're like, okay, crab, cross, Virgin Mary, SpongeBob. I have no idea what this podcast is. And so if you write a written review and you just say what you like about the podcast, what you've gained from it, that can really help to grow the audience. Thank you so much for your support. And now my conversation with Meg Hunter-Kilmer. Meg Hunter-Kilmer is a speaker, author, and self-proclaimed hobo for Christ. She received her bachelor's and master's degrees in theology from the University of Notre Dame and has spent the last 10 years traveling the world sharing the gospel. Her books are Pray for Us, 75 Saints Who Sinned, Suffered, and Struggled on Their Way to Holiness, and a children's book called Saints Around the World. Her next book is called A Year in the Word, a Catholic Bible Journal, and it will be released in 2022. Meg, thank you for joining me.
I am so excited to be here.
I know. I have not seen you in, like 5 years or something.
Which is silly, but I feel like COVID has just made everything so ridiculous.
That is true. Yeah.
It's been too long for everybody, basically, except the people that I'm like, I'm going to live at your house for a month.
Yeah, right.
Okay, great.
Yeah. To me, COVID is like, it's like the new BC. It's like before COVID, after COVID. That's like the new time division, which actually, now that I think about it, sounds a little bit blasphemous because, before Christ.
Yeah, well, that's all right.
Okay, this is funny, though, because actually, apparently we recorded a podcast like 8 years ago or something, and I totally forgot about it. And then I had a friend who was like, yeah, I found this podcast you did with Meg Hunter-Kilmer. And I was like, wait, I don't remember doing that.
I don't remember what it was about. I remember we recorded it in the office after a camp one day.
Yeah, apparently it was about discernment.
Oh, okay.
Which is like my least favorite topic, honestly, in some ways.
Fair.
But yeah, so that's somewhere out there in the, I guess it's still out there if someone I know found it.
Yeah. Just search for Mary Rose Depperschmidt on iTunes.
Okay, so speaking of COVID though, how did that affect your travel ministry? Were you also totally shut down?
So it was actually kind of, I mean, I don't want to say COVID was convenient for me because
Yeah.
it obviously wasn't. But I have been living out of my car for 10 years and sleeping in strangers' houses and traveling nonstop. And in like February of 2020, I was like, you know what? I think I need to write some books. I think the Lord is asking me to just take some time just to focus on writing. And so I cleared my schedule. I found a place to stay starting in March of 2020 so that I didn't have anything going on for like 3 months. And then the whole world shut down. And I was
Yeah.
like, oh, well, actually, that works out for me, you know?
Right, right.
So I just sat down and wrote 2 books.
Wow. So did that mean though that you had like no source of income like whatsoever during that time?
Yeah, but that kind of happens to me a lot. I mean, I guess I was writing and like,
Did you have
sometimes
a
people
book
pay me to write.
contract?
I did, yeah. So I had I guess some money from advances, but
Okay.
yeah, like when I go abroad, I can't charge any money, and so like regularly, I'll just have 3 months where I'm not making any money, and it's kind of fine. I don't charge anything anyway,
Yeah.
so it's all just providence, and I had a free place to stay during that time, so it
Okay.
wasn't any
Okay.
different.
So you're clothed and housed and that's about the majority of what
Right,
you need
exactly. I
money
need like
for.
food and health insurance,
Right.
which health insurance will drive you into poverty. But
Yeah. It's really true. I mean, like my insurance isn't that bad because it's just me, but I look at like the family plans and I'm like, if somebody just had my salary and had even like one kid, there's no way.
yeah, it's absurd.
Yeah.
It's absurd.
Yeah. Wow. So you've been doing this for 10 years. Are you tired?
Girl, yes. Thank you for asking. Yes, I really very much am. I mean, but I have been for like years.
Right.
Um, and there's like different kinds of tired in different seasons. Sometimes it really is like a physical exhaustion, and I've just gotten a lot better at being gentle with myself there. Like when I was first living in people's houses, I had this feeling that like I have to live on a normal person's schedule. And so if they're going to be up at 7, I need to be up at 7. And that's just not the way my body works.
Yeah.
And I have some health conditions that complicate that. But then also, like, I'm just a night person, right?
Yeah.
And we have this sense in our American value system that it's like more virtuous to go to bed early and get up early than to stay up
Yes.
late and get up late. And so it feels like there is this value judgment if you're sleeping in. And so I would always feel really guilty if I was sleeping later than other people, even though they would go to bed at 10 and I would stay up until 2 working on stuff. And then I'd like still feel like I had to get up at 7. And so it's been a couple of years since I was like, you know what? I don't have to be embarrassed when I need to be asleep. Like that's okay. And it really all started because I was staying at these old people's house and I didn't know them and they were like 85 and I overslept until 1 p.m. And I was so embarrassed and I got up and I was like, "Oh my gosh, I am so sorry." And this little old lady who like grew up during the depression and probably like milked a cow at 4 a.m. her
Right.
entire life looked at me and was like, "Honey, if you didn't even know it was daylight until 1 o'clock in the afternoon, you clearly needed the sleep." And it was the first time that I was like, "Oh my gosh, it's not lazy to be asleep." Like
Wow.
you have a body and your body is allowed to have needs. And I don't know that I feel like there's a lot of spiritual growth in that too, and recognizing that like you don't have to conform yourself to other people's ideas of holiness, to other people's ideas of faith and virtue, that you can say like, I know who God made me to be and I know how he's calling me to follow him, and it's okay that that doesn't fit in the box that everybody else expects it to fit in.
Yeah, no, I relate to that so much because it was funny actually. I was talking with a friend on my drive up here and I was like, "Can we start a novena that I can just like learn how to like fall asleep at night and get up in the morning because this has been
Uh-huh.
a lifelong struggle." But like, we were chatting before about my new job and I feel like my new job fits my body clock because when I was a teacher, I was first of all I was
Oh,
never on time and every day I would drive onto campus and be like, please God, just make me invisible so that nobody sees me coming in late. But like now that I'm on a college campus, it's like, well, there's going to be a lot of evening events. And so if I like, let's say I work an 8-hour day, well, if I'm going to be there till 9 or 10 o'clock at night, then technically I don't need to come in until 11 or 12, which means that I don't need to get up until,
Yes.
whatever, 9 o'clock or something, and I'm still working a full day. I'm still, I'm not just like on the couch all day, like eating chips, but I'm going to bed later and I'm getting up later. And that is really like natural for my circadian rhythm, or it just feels natural to me. And yeah, I mean, I'm so with you. Like,
I was the same way when I was working in college campus ministry. I was working in an office where everybody was there from 8 to 5. And I
yeah,
was like, okay, so I'm gonna come in at 11. And they were like, well, but we get here at 8. And I was like, but the kids don't. And my job is not to sit around and do paperwork. Like maybe that works for y'all. That's great. But my job is to be present to these kids. And like my trying to conform myself to this arbitrary American standard of productivity doesn't make any sense given the work that I've actually been asked to do. So I'm going
yeah,
to come in at 11 and I'm probably going to work 14-hour days because I'm irresponsible.
right.
And like, we just don't even need to worry about it. It's fine.
Right. Yeah. Well, okay. So you know a lot about the saints. And are there any saints who are like, I don't know, not early risers? Because I feel like, you look at the lives of saints, they're like, you need to get up at 4 a.m. And I don't know. Are there any saints that we can relate to on this level?
Yeah, it's funny because I think there are a lot of things that we have imbued value into, and then we play those elements of the lives of the saints up, right? Like productivity is something that in Western European understanding is something that's like really, really important. So we love these saints who only got 2 to 3 hours of sleep a night. And I'm
Right.
like, okay, but for like some people's bodies just work that way. And when we glorify that particular like distortion of the human condition, it can make people feel that there's something wrong with them because they have bodies with other needs. And so if we have saints who needed a lot of sleep, other than the ones who were like, bedridden and chronically ill.
Sure.
If we have saints who stayed up late and got up late, it's not something that got put in the stories because people were uncomfortable with it. They were like, oh, this seems like it might be vice. And probably a lot of saints felt that they had to overcome it. And some of that makes sense because given the time, like when I am up until 2 o'clock in the morning, it's because I've been like responding to people on social media and like being present to their issues until like 11 o'clock. And then I'm like doing this research online, which I can do on the internet. And then I'm like reading books, like when I'm up late and being productive for the kingdom. Then there's also when I'm just on Twitter for hours. But like barring that, it is possible for me to be productive for the kingdom and serving the Lord at 1 o'clock in the morning. And it wasn't possible in the 17th century. Like you didn't have electricity and you didn't have books, like
right,
a lot of people.
Right.
And so I think that, hopefully we'll see some night owl saints coming up, but I haven't encountered any yet.
Right. But no, that's actually a good point just about electricity. I mean, we kind of take for granted that for most of human history, you had like fire and candles and that's about it. And so you just weren't going to stay up late because you couldn't see anything.
Right, exactly. And so people go to bed early because what else is there to do, Whereas
exactly.
For me, everything shuts down and I'm like, now there's nothing to distract me. I can really just focus on doing the work that I need to do without like anybody posting anything new on Instagram because
True.
they're all in bed.
True. Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. So when you were writing your books during the pandemic, like did you have kind of like a system, like I write for this many hours a day, I research for this many hours a day, or were you kind of more like, well, let me wait until an idea like jumps out at me?
So these were really easy books to write because it's the saints. And so it's not like, you don't really have to be inspired so much as you just have to like do the research until the story becomes clear in your mind. If my first book that I wrote, which has not yet been published, and who knows what the Lord is going to do with that. But it was a commentary on the Gospels, and that like a narrative reflection on the life of Christ. And that like I had to be sort of in the right headspace to get to work on it. Whereas with writing the saints, it's like, okay, well, I know I want to write about this person. So I'm just going to research. And as I'm researching, like the story just starts to come out.
Right.
It also helps that it was Lent. And so I was not watching TV. working in Easter is harder for me because I'm like, we should be rejoicing and we should be
Right.
exalting and we should be watching Schitt's Creek for 14 straight hours, like
uh, and eating donuts, and then when you eat sugar, you don't want to do things.
exactly. And then I'm like, oh, I should write something. And I'm like, well, but now it's 5 o'clock in the morning. So it's really just time to go to bed, maybe tomorrow. And then the next day is still Easter, right?
Right.
So having balance can be a little bit trickier for me. So it was convenient that the pandemic
Sure.
coincided with Lent.
Did you write these books in the span of like 2 or 3 months, like that quickly?
Each of them took about 6 weeks. Yeah.
That's actually incredible.
It's a little bit absurd. I tend to like hyper focus,
Yeah.
and then I get really excited and I want to know everything, and then I get it all out there. The second book, the adults book, Pray for Us, I had written about half of it already and published it in various different outlets. So I guess I wrote a book and a half in 3 months.
Okay. Nice. Wow. So what kind of got you so excited about the Saints? Like, is this something that was always a part of your faith, or was there like a time when you just like fell in love with the Saints?
Yeah, no, I was really not into the Saints for a very long time. And I think there's a lot of reasons. Part of it is that we tell the stories so badly. They're just they're saccharine and they're sanitized and they're completely irrelevant to our lives. And it's very like she was very holy and she never sinned and she became an end the end. And you're like,
Right.
good for you. Like,
Right.
or we focus so much on the miraculous that it all seems unattainable, and we whitewash out any struggle or even like just normal humanity, like we don't emphasize their little passions or that she liked watercolors or anything like that. And so all of these stories just seem like, well, I have to become so much less myself in order to become Christ. And that's just not the reality of the saints. It's just that we're telling the stories badly. And so I think for a lot of years, I would hear these stories, and all of the women that anybody ever talked about had no real personality.
Yeah.
They were all just sweet and meek and mild and gentle and quiet, and that is not me. And I tried to fit into that mold for like 6 weeks. I wanted to murder everybody because that's not how God made me to be, right? And then I discovered Teresa of Avila, and I was like, well,
Yeah.
one time there was a salty female saint, so I guess there's hope for me, right? But the saints felt to me like something that was not blasphemy, and that was about as much as I could give it. And, anybody I knew who loved the saints, it really did seem like it was to the exclusion of Jesus. It was a lot of, well, when you can't go to Jesus, then Saint Rita will hook you up. And I was like, you can always go to Jesus. That's literally the whole point of our entire religion. Like, what are we doing, right? And then I read a good book about the saints. I read Modern Saints by Anne Ball.
Okay.
And I was like, oh my gosh, these stories are interesting and they're relevant. And I realized that these stories told well were sort of like a backdoor entry into preaching the gospel, because like, I can't sit down with someone and be like, let me tell you about Jesus, and have them not bristle at that.
Right.
But I can sit down and be like, oh, do you want to hear about this really amazing saint who walked 3,700 miles because everybody was super racist, and so he went over their heads to the Pope to let them become a priest? People are like, yes, I do want to hear that story. And I'm like, good.
Yeah.
And I'm going to tell you about Jesus too.
Right.
And eventually I realized that so many of the stories of the saints, when we tell them well, are highlighting an aspect of our lives that we think makes us ineligible for God's love, and putting a halo on it. And saying like, here's what holiness looks like when your parents are divorced. Here's what holiness looks like when you're dealing with mental illness. Here's what holiness looks like when you are a really incredible pianist and you have everything the world has to offer you and you have to make a decision. Like, what does it look like to follow Jesus in the midst of this? And recognizing just the power for drawing people into the heart of Jesus when you can tell them a story that resonates with their own lives and say, look, God can canonize this element of your experience that you think makes you unlovable. Like, he can use that to draw you deeper into his heart and to bring glory to his name. And that was when I was like, okay, well, this is what I was made to do. Like, I've always been a storyteller. I just never really had good stories to tell. And discovering that God had made me a storyteller so that I could tell these stories so that people could come to know his love in a more profound way. I was like, all right, let's go.
Yeah. No, I remember when I was first like kind of going through, I guess you could say, a reversion. Not that I was ever fully away from the faith, but like really deepening it, like senior year of high school. And I was also really struggling with like anxiety. Like I was, it was kind of a weird juxtaposition of like, great in this way, terrible in this way. But I was terrified that I was going to die young because I was trying to become holy. And like all the saints, it just seems like all the saints die young, It's
Right.
just like, Saint Therese like dies at 24. Like all these saints, they don't live, which is not true because like plenty of saints grow old. I mean, like, Mother Teresa is like, was like ancient. But I just like, my understanding of the saints was like they basically like lived really short, painful lives and then they died and went to heaven. And I was like, but this doesn't, obviously you have a limit to the control over your life, but it just, I don't know, it made me really scared of holiness because I thought holiness meant just like, I'm going to get a terrible disease and die young.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I think a lot of times what people need to hear is like, it's okay to be ordinary, right? Like you don't have to levitate and you don't have to travel to distant lands and you don't have to die gruesomely, like whether through a terrible illness or through martyrdom. And so telling people the stories of saints who lived these ordinary lives, right? Or saints who had many of the good things of this world. Like I talk a lot about Venerable Teresita Quevedo to young people. And I'm like, look, she was voted best dressed in her class. She was captain of the basketball team. She was the number 2 tennis player in her school. She loved going to bullfights. She drove a car too fast for her dad. He wouldn't drive with her. She pierced her friend's ears with a safety pin. Like, don't do that. Go to Claire's. And that's not...
No. Don't go to Claire's. Go to a tattoo parlor. Okay.
Go to a tattoo parlor.
They use a needle instead of a gun. And anyways.
There you go. Now we're learning. Over there at St. Mary's College, we know all about the piercing. I'll tell you what. But that's not before she became a saint. She died at 19, right? That's what holiness looked like for her. And she entered a convent, but it wasn't like I have to reject all of these things of my previous life. This was a flowering of who she already was. And to see that it's possible to run after Jesus and not have him take away every good thing that you love. Right. That just that invitation, like, look, I'm not telling you right now, enter a convent. I'm not telling you right now, give up everything you love. I'm telling you right now, let Jesus love you and see what he does with that. And maybe that means you're still best dressed in your class and captain of the basketball team. And maybe that means next year you become a Carmelite and die gruesomely of meningitis. Like I don't know, but like it's less likely now. We have better medicine. Sure. It's fine. You'll be fine. You'll be fine.
But yeah, you mentioned St. Teresa of Avila, and I found out recently that she was like really into tobacco. And I was like, no. Yeah, like I think they called it snuff, even though I think that word has many different meanings. But yeah, she was like a crazy like tobacco user. And I was like, wait, how is she like in the interior castle and then like has this like tobacco thing? Because in my mind, it's just like, I don't know, like you shouldn't be attached to tobacco, but at the same time, tobacco is obviously very addictive and it's really hard to quit.
Was that earlier or was that like
I think it was when she was in the convent, but I'll have to like fact check this.
First part of the convent or second part?
Okay. That's a good point. That's a good point. I will have to check on that because yeah, she kind of has her own like conversion within the convent life. But one of the popes too was like, I don't know.
See, from really anybody but cloistered religious,
right?
I'm like, I could totally see it, and I like using tobacco. The church has not declared to be a sin, and obviously, like addiction complicates things. Whatever. I just feel like a cloistered Carmelite would be like, this is not according to my vow of poverty. Like it's a different thing. It's a different thing from smoking cigarettes if you're living in the world.
Well, apparently too, my sister, she did some volunteer work at one of the Missionary of Charities house in DC, and there's like a tradition, like I guess Mother Teresa loved chocolate, and so they always have chocolate in the house because it's kind of like in honor of their founder. Like, Mother Teresa obviously lived a very austere life, but she had a little sweet tooth going on.
I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. God gave her a sweet tooth. Embrace it.
Embrace it. So okay, the saint you just mentioned, when and where did she live?
So she was 1930 to 1950 in Spain.
Okay. So a lot of the saints...
And she's beautiful. You got to look her up. Teresita Quevedo. She's like movie star pretty.
Wow. Well, yeah, I mean, best dressed,
Right.
Yeah, because a lot of the saints that you write about and talk about, they're not the ones that people have really heard of. And so how do you even come across them?
I know, I'm such an obnoxious hipster when it comes to saints. As soon as someone gets popular, I'm like over them. Like knew Carlo Acutis when, right? Like
Oh.
Father Ray and I went and found him when he was still in the cemetery in Assisi. Like before he got moved to the church, he was still a
Whoa.
servant of God. We were like so hardcore, and I'm standing there in front of this guy's grave, and I'm like, I'm older than him, and he's going to be a saint. Like, what have I been doing with my life? And my friend was like, well, not dying. Like that's sort of part of it. It's a little bit complicated to be a saint
the
if you're
last
not dead.
step.
It's like fair point, yeah. But I was like so into him, and I'm telling everybody about him, and then I succeeded, and everybody loved him, and he got super popular, and I was like, oh, I'm kind of over him now. Like I'm such a brat. I know, I drive myself crazy, but I love the unknown saints because I just feel like there's so much more to holiness than these little images that we have from the saints who we've stripped everything out of their lives. And so I spend a lot of time just Googling and going down rabbit holes. And some of it is I put a lot of effort into representation in the work that I do.
Yeah.
Ethnic representation of different states in life, of different personality types, of different disabilities, of different chronic illnesses. And so I do a lot of work where I'm like, okay, well, what saints are there with limb differences, or what saints are there with intellectual disabilities, or what saints are there whose parents abandoned them, like so that everybody can see themselves. And so I'm just a really good Googler.
Yeah.
And so I start Googling, and then there will be some that I find that I'm like, ooh, I think I need to learn more about you. And sometimes like I learn about a saint and I'm like, yeah, okay, well, apparently you're awesome, but I can't quite figure out why, and part of that is just that we're so bad at telling the stories that it can be hard to find a story. And I can't love a saint until I figure out the story, until I figure out like sort of the meaning of their life, at least in as much as it relates to me and the people that I serve. But yeah, I sort of latch on like a dog to a bone, and I dig deeper and deeper, and I'm searching in all of these different languages, and I'm like, now I have a library access again, which is very exciting. So I can like use all of the academic libraries, and I can request books via interlibrary loan, and I can get all of the sources on, they'll like scan things and just email them to me, and I'm like, yes. I am the fanciest person in the world.
Do you read in any other languages?
I do. I use Google Translate for a lot, but I can read French, Spanish, and Italian. It's usually quicker just to use my Google Translate app. Even in the languages that I do read, but there are some documents where like that's just not really going to work out for whatever reason, and like if the font is weird and Google Translate can't handle it, and so those three I can get along pretty well.
Okay, because you've like also written about saints from like India, and I'm thinking like, are there primary sources in English about these people?
Sometimes, and sometimes I just really am crossing my fingers and hoping that Google Translate is everything that it claims to be. And I've had like I worry that I'm promulgating false information because of translation issues, because there was one time that I was researching Saint Rafael Giseri Valencia, and he's Mexican. But I grew up on the East Coast, and so when I learned Spanish in school, I learned Spanish from Spain, which is silliness. And so I was reading this document about him, and it was talking about this one time when he was in jail and he was complaining that he was hungry, and so they brought in a tray full of tortas, which in Spain is cakes. And so I'm picturing like a whole bunch of layer cakes.
Yeah.
And he ate 4 of them, and he was a very large man. So like it's possible that he could have, but I was like, bro, that's a little much. And so I'm like getting ready to write in this book that he ate 4 layer cakes. And then I was like, torta is a sandwich. It's a sandwich. Oh my goodness. Yeah. So praise the Lord, I fixed that before it went to press.
But still, like, dang, he's getting some good food in prison. Like,
well, yeah. And then they were like, why are you so hungry? And he was like, because I'm a musician and I had to sell my instrument. And they were like, oh yeah, you're a musician. We know you're a priest. And they gave him an accordion. And we're like, if you're a musician, prove it. But he really was a musician. And so he played beautifully, and they were like, oh my gosh, we are so sorry. And they let him go with the accordion and 50 pesos. And you're just like, who is this guy? Like, I love it. He gets arrested and he comes out with a full belly, and accordion, and a wallet full of money.
Right. All things work for the good of those who love God, right?
Exactly.
Wow. Are there any saints that right now are like your BFFs?
Oh, I mean, always so many.
Yeah. Do you have like a go-to, like, or is it always changing like based on who you're like researching?
I mean, that's definitely part of it. I kind of go through like obsessive phases
Right.
where I'm just like like Saint David Sahayam was canonized in May, and I like basically started every talk I gave with him for like the next 3 months because I was like, this guy is amazing. He's so cool, Mary Rose. He was a an 18th century Indian man who was born into a high caste family, and he was like a martial artist and a soldier and super successful. But everything in his life started to go wrong, and there was famine, and his cattle were dying, and there were deaths in his family, and it just really read a lot like Job. And he's
Mm.
performing all of these sacrifices because he's Hindu, and he's like trying to find which god he can appease. And then there was a Christian man, and like he's in um, Tamil Nadu, which is right next to Kerala, and Kerala has had Catholics since the year 52, right? Like
Yeah.
India has been Catholic since my ancestors were worshiping trees. This is like old
Right.
news, but there was such a cultural division between these groups of people. Like he wouldn't ever have been friends with Christians, but there was a European Christian who had been a prisoner of war, and he's hearing all that David Sahayam was suffering, and he was like, well, let me tell you about Jesus, and let me tell you about suffering that has meaning, and this God who came into our lives to suffer with us. And David Simon's like, okay, okay. Then he's like, well, let me tell you the story of Job. And he heard the story of Job, and it resonated with him so much that he was like, oh my gosh, like this is the way that God is drawing me to his heart. Like
Mm.
this is the way that I can come to know him. And so many saints, it's like, well, they suffered terribly, but because they knew Jesus, it was okay. But this was the first saint that I encountered what was really like his suffering was what brought him to Jesus in the first place, right? He didn't have
Yeah.
that foundation of the theology. And knowing how many people I've encountered who enter into suffering without that relationship with Jesus, and to have this intercessor who can pray for them that that suffering would really conform their hearts to Jesus, I was like, this guy is incredible. So he converts to Catholicism, knowing that there are going to be consequences, right? It's illegal to convert to Catholicism, but like maybe not for him. Like that, he had a lot of privilege, a lot of connections, and so
Okay.
it's one of
Yeah.
those things. Like there are some laws that just don't apply to certain races and classes and
Sure.
social standings.
Sure. You can be above the
And so he
law.
kind of exactly like he's definitely above the law to a degree. So like converting was not a problem, but he converted, and he was like, if I worship a God who became man in a middle of nowhere village in some backwoods colonial outpost, born to an impoverished young woman who died like a criminal, I can't subscribe to the caste system. Like it doesn't make any sense to say that people have less dignity because of the accident of their birth if this is the God that I worship. And so he was like, okay, well, I'm done. And the way that I'm going to be done with the caste system is that I'm going to entirely subvert it by everything that I do.
Wow.
And so he starts eating with Christians, and he starts spending time with the Dalits, with the untouchables, and all of these other soldiers are converting through his witness, and they're also working against the caste system. And the government of Tamil Nadu was kind of like, look, people want to be Christians, it's fine. It's like, we don't love it, but it's not like that huge of a deal. But if you start chipping away at the underpinnings of the caste system that holds up our entire society, like now we have a problem.
Wow.
And so really it was fighting against the systemic injustice that signed his death certificate. And he was tortured, and he was sent into exile, and some of his tortures actually involved hot pepper. So I don't know. I was when you like eat food that's too hot, you can ask St. David's Higham to pray for you. They like would rub it into his body, and they like put him
Whoa.
in a sauna with like peppers in the water, so he's like breathing in all of the smell. Like it was pretty gruesome.
Wow.
And still he just had this profound peace and this rootedness in Jesus. And so he's in exile, and he's like chained to a tree, and these people are coming to visit him and asking him for wisdom. Like Christians, of course, but also Hindus are coming to honor him as a holy man.
Which is kind
And
of like
finally
such
they
an
were,
Eastern thing, like to go visit a
yes,
sage like at a tree. Like that's exactly what the Buddha was doing.
yes. I mean, it's so beautiful because he really like he was a Roman Rite Catholic. He wasn't Syro Malabar,
Okay.
but he didn't have any concept that in becoming a Christian, he had to become a Westerner.
Mm.
And he certainly had the advantage that there at that point were 1700 years of history of Indian Christianity, but that wasn't the branch of Christianity that he entered, right? And so just this deep rootedness in his Indianness, and that his holiness was a South Asian holiness. It wasn't like an imitation of a European holiness. And
Yeah.
even the artwork of him, like his posture and the way that he's dressed, like this is not a man who has become a Christian by becoming a Westerner. This is a man whose Christianity is deeply rooted in his Indian identity. He's a very, very cool guy. Eventually, he was martyred, and he was just canonized in May. But there's so many levels of his life that I think are really important for our world right now, right? This idea that we have to take risks to fight against systemic injustice, the idea that our suffering isn't just something that like God is present with us in, but something that God like specifically is drawing us to himself through, the willingness to take risks for love of the marginalized and oppressed. Like he's fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we forget that like a lot of saints were not well liked in their time, and a lot of them even weren't well liked by the church, you know.
Yes.
Which is sort of funny because like, you know, we're like, oh, the saints, you know, we name a church after you, we have a painting of you, we have, you know, whatever. And it's like, yeah, like 200 years ago you guys were the ones who were, you know, persecuting this person.
Right, like literally excommunicated them, and now you've given them a halo.
Right.
But it's beautiful, I think, especially in the season we're in as a church right now, where like there's so much division and strife within our church, and there's so much feeling of opposition between like people on every part of the spectrum and the hierarchy. To look at these saints and to see what it looked like for them to be obedient while also being faithful to the call that God had given them, you know. And you see these people who are like, they're excommunicated by these garbage hierarchs, right? Like these bishops who are just in it for themselves. And it's like objectively wrong what the bishops have done, but they do have that authority. And these saints, they're gentle and they're meek. And there are certain things that they're like, I'm not going to stop doing this because this is something that I'm objectively called to by the Lord. But it's never over something that's like a personal preference, you know, like.
Right. Or they don't make themselves into like, well, like, oh, I'm so oppressed and martyred and like, you know, like everybody come like pay attention to me. Like they're just like very like humble about it. And I don't know, like, they don't use that to their advantage, like gain sympathy in a weird way.
And there's always a reverence, even when it's obvious that the person above them is doing something wrong, you know. And like there are certainly moments when we do have to defy authority, right? Like if your bishop tells you to cover up abuse, like you don't do it, right? You never cover up abuse. Like you go to the police, right? But if your bishop tells you, I've been telling people this for years, if my bishop tells me to wear a clown wig to mass, I'm going to wear a clown wig to mass. I'm going to write to Rome, but I'm going to do it in the clown wig because my bishop has authority over the liturgy, right? And so like recognizing our role as Christians and where we have the obligation to submit, because that's like kind of part of the whole deal of the church, and where we have the obligation to also call those above us to holiness, right? And it's never through snark, and it's never through derision, and it's never through scorn, and it's never through calling people ugly names on Twitter. And I see so much of this where I'm like, look, you might be right about this approach to the liturgy, or about this approach to COVID policies, or about this approach to Eucharistic piety, or, you know, like all of these different things. You might be right, but you do not become a saint by trash talking your bishop. Like you just don't.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, I was just reading, I mean, the famous 1 Corinthians 13, you know, love is patient, love is kind. I mean, when he says like, if you have faith to move mountains, but you don't have love, you're nothing. You know, if you speak in tongues, but you don't have love, you're nothing. And so it's like, if you have all the correct theological opinions, but you don't have love, it means nothing. You know, and it's that's a hard thing to say and to hear, because obviously the truth matters, you know, it's not irrelevant, but like charity trumps everything.
Yes.
Yeah. I want to talk to you about one saint that is a well-known saint that you wrote about, and then like your comment sections blew up, and it was fascinating to read through. And that's Maria Goretti.
Woo, yeah.
So talk a little bit about what you said about her life and her death, and like why you think people got so upset about that.
Yeah, I think that Maria Goretti is a beautiful saint. I think she was an incredible little girl. I think she loved Jesus like crazy. And I think that the way that we tell her story can be incredibly damaging because we talk about Maria as a martyr to purity, as though she would have been made impure by being sexually assaulted. And that's just not the case. And it's not what the church teaches. And people get real cranky when you talk about this because when she was canonized, they said that she was martyred for preserving her chastity. And
Right.
here's the thing is it's debatable whether or not canonization is infallible. There's like a whole theological conversation there. But it is not at all debatable whether or not the reason for someone's canonization is infallible. Like nobody argues that a pope's homily at somebody's canonization is preserved by the Holy Spirit from all error, right? That's not a thing. But it certainly has a lot of weight, right? And I wouldn't just willy-nilly throw out these assessments that popes have made, but I think it's really important for us to recognize that our understanding of human psychology has grown. And for a lot of years, the way that human beings in general and the church in particular talked about a woman's response to sexual assault, it sounded like fighting back was virtue, and being incapable of fighting back was weakness. And that's just not true. It is not more virtuous for your response in the moment to be fighting as opposed to fleeing or freezing or even fawning, which is another response that we see happens naturally in some human beings, right? That when you are under threat, your body immediately is like, you have to appease this person by just doing whatever they want because that's what's going to save you. It is not more virtuous if a car is driving down the road for me to jump out of the way than it is for me to freeze in my tracks and get run over by a car, right? And so it's the same thing when we're talking about sexual assault. And I think the way that we talk about Maria Goretti, so many survivors of sexual assault feel that they're being blamed for their assault and told that it's their fault they were assaulted because if they were holier, they would have fought back and been killed. And they're also being told that it's better to be dead than to survive a sexual assault. Wow. And that was not John Paul II's intention when he delivered that homily. And it was not the church's intention in canonizing Maria Goretti, but it's absolutely something that people are hearing. And I cannot tell you the number of people who have reached out to me when I speak about Maria Goretti or when I write about Maria Goretti who are like, thank you so much for saying that, because every time I hear Maria Goretti, I feel guilty for being raped. Yeah. And that can't be the church's intention, but people get really angry when I say she is not a saint because her automatic reaction in that moment was to fight back. She's a saint because she was an incredibly holy little girl. She's a saint because she forgave afterwards, which is also sort of a narrative that can be complicated because it makes it sound like we're saying if you don't feel good feelings about your assailant, then you aren't holy, right? And forgiveness is not about feelings. Forgiveness is a choice. But when we tell these stories badly, it really damages people. And I think a lot of the people in the comments on that post just really weren't considering who they were hurting. Yeah. And some of it is people who themselves have been hurt who are like trying to figure out a way to survive. And I understand that, and I honor that people are on their own journey and trying to figure stuff out. But a lot of people were just saying things like, well, if you really know who you are in Jesus, like you would do anything to keep from being violated in this way. And I'm like, what is wrong with you? Right. Why would you re-traumatize people in this way? And honestly, I don't know. I don't know what it's going to take to salvage the narrative surrounding Maria Goretti. At this point, I feel like removing her from the general calendar might be our best bet. Not removing her from the canon of saints at all. But, there are certain saints that are on everybody's calendar. And I don't know that Maria Goretti needs to be one of them right now while we have all of these priests who are telling her story in such a damaging way. And, like the people I talk to who are like, yeah, I used to be Catholic until I heard this homily about Maria Goretti saying that it was my fault that I was assaulted. Wow. And I just can't do it anymore. Like if God hates me for having been raped, then I'm done, wow. And like it's not worth it. Like and I know that Maria Goretti would say that it's not worth it too. And I think her story can be told well, but it just has to be really trauma informed and it has to be led by survivors.
Yeah. Well, yeah, a couple of things come to mind as you're speaking. Like, one, technically, I mean, the perspective that you're giving on her, it's not really new. Like, if you go back to, I think it's Augustine's
No.
City of God, like he talks about the rape of Lucretia and how her chastity was not damaged in that. And I mean, Augustine is also
Right.
someone who had like pretty puritanical views and stuff
Oh
about
yes.
sex. So like if he's acknowledging like, no, in no way was she stained by this violation, then that's not really a modern idea. And also in scripture, I mean, there's a lot of people who are raped in scripture and never are they seen as
Mm-hmm.
blamed, you know?
Right.
Um, there's, I mean, you just don't see any of that kind of like narrative surrounding what happened to them. And even like, I mean, the character of Bathsheba is interesting. You know, some people say like David sexually assaulted her, others say like she was complicit, and there's probably somewhere in the middle, you know, but like she's
I don't know. When Nathan gives the example, she's an unblemished lamb.
fair
I
enough, fair
feel
enough.
like the parable that follows makes it very clear that she had no complicity in any of it. Like
Yeah.
maybe you can read the actual event, you can try and add in some complexity there, but Nathan's take on it was like you came in here and slaughtered an unblemished lamb.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, that's what I was gonna
So
say. I mean, like maybe you could make the case that like maybe on some level she was like, oh, the king, you know. But even if that is the case, like exactly like you said, like the scripture does not in any way present any blame on her. Like
right.
everything is on David. He's the one who. Although I will say, I feel like she does suffer when her kid dies, which kind of
Right.
feels like a punishment.
Yeah,
It
the scripture very much frames it as a punishment to David
it
and not
does,
to
it
her. And
does.
so which is tricky because you're like, but then she's also being punished. But you're like, well, no, there are just consequences when people do horrific things to you,
Sure.
you know? And like, it's hard because God could have stepped in and protected her in that moment. And that's really the problem of evil, right? Like,
Yeah.
why does God not step in and protect the innocent? Like, why didn't he protect Bathsheba from the assault? Why didn't he protect Uriah? Why didn't he save the baby? Like, we don't know.
Yeah.
We don't know. Like we know that God is good and we know that he allowed these things and it's really hard to hold that intention. And in the beatific vision, we will understand it. And it's okay that we don't right now. And it's okay to say, this is awful and I don't get it. And I trust that God is still good.
Right. Yeah. No, absolutely. Man. This has been awesome. I love listening to you. You have such a passion and you have, like you said, you have the greatest stories. Like you are a storyteller at heart. And so I just want to encourage everybody to pick up a copy of your books. And also like follow you either on Instagram or Facebook. You post a lot of saint stories on there and you're always teaching me about saints I've never heard of or teaching me things I didn't know about saints I have heard of. And so that's just a great place to follow you if you aren't ready to make the commitment and buy a book.
Yes, there's lots of free content on my social media and I've got a podcast and every once in a while I remember I have a blog, but that's all pretty old
What's
stuff.
your
That's like
podcast
before I was
called?
into
Yeah.
Hobo for Christ.
Hobo for Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And what are your social handles?
So the easiest thing to do is Google Hobo for Christ and you'll find
Okay.
my website and then you can click through on all of the little buttons and follow me all over the place.
Okay. Nice. What's next for you?
Well, I'm in Michigan right now. I'm with my illustrator from Saints Around the World,
Oh,
and my
cool.
best baby friend. And I'm helping her out with the kids so that she can illustrate, hopefully, our next book.
Yay. That's
Yeah,
awesome.
yeah. I'm
Cool.
excited.
Cool. Well, best of luck to you. And yeah, people, I mean, you just kind of like people just email you and book you to come speak at their church or their youth group or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, check
Yeah.
Meg out. Awesome. Alrighty. Take care.
Thanks, friend.
Just gonna check a couple points on the bio and then I'll kind of tell you
Okay.
what we're gonna run through and then it'll be awesome. All right. So you from Notre Dame, you got your bachelor's and your master's, right?
Mm-hmm.
And were they both in theology?
Yep.
Okay.
Technically, it's the University of Notre Dame, not Notre Dame
Oh,
University.
really?
Yeah.
That is such a Notre Dame thing.
I mean, just because there are schools called Notre Dame
That's
University,
true. Okay,
and
so
that's a
from
different school. So,
okay, so from the University of Notre Dame. Um, I just watched. I don't know if you ever watched Netflix, but I just watched the documentary about Monte Teo.
oh, I haven't seen it yet, but I've heard it's really
It's
good.
really good. There was so much I didn't know about it, like because I just kind of heard like, oh, this person had an imaginary girlfriend, and you're like, oh no.
Poor
But yeah,
guy.
yeah. I mean, yeah, you really feel for him. It's like, and I also didn't realize he was like, because I didn't go to Notre Dame, like I don't really watch football. I didn't realize how big of a deal he was,
Oh yeah.
like just
Oh
before
yeah.
all this. I thought he became famous because of the fake girlfriend.
No, I mean, to almost win the Heisman as a defensive player is unheard of. Like
Yeah,
he was a superstar, and then he just got smashed into smithereens, and then he
right,
fell apart on the national stage, and everybody laughed at us for a decade. So
right, right.
it's fine. It's whatever.